Annyeonghaseyo. This is the Filmlinks podcast World Tour,
a special summer series where we explore filmmaking from around the world.
Nanyun Jonathan.
Kaligo Nanin Alex.
Guigo Igos in Jusabim il Ibnda, Kruel, Korea. We got some interesting violence and mix of tones this week, Alex.
Yeah, it's definitely a combination of multiple genres and a lot of the films we're going to be talking about this week. And all of them are super interesting and definitely entertaining. Certainly a very, very entertaining, I hesitate to say easy to watch movie, but like we're approaching that popcorn bucket barrier almost, where you can just kind of sit back and relax.
It's kind of a progression with the movies that we'll be talking about today. Koreans are actually kind of known for making rather violent films, and we go from a film that is quite tragic to one that is more comedic and played for laughs than anything. But the violence pervades through all of our movies this week.
It certainly does, and it is pretty entertaining, and it will be a good look at them. So what films are we going to talk about today, Jonathan?
We're starting off today with Oldboy. This film has been acclaimed across cultures in America and in Korea. It is a neo-noir directed by director Chan-wook Park, and it is actually the second part of a trilogy, kind of a spiritual trilogy. I don't know that it's this follows that kind of trilogy, but it's called the Vengeance Trilogy. It is preceded by Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, and it is followed up by Lady Vengeance.
Right, and the second film we're going to talk about today is The Host from 2006, directed by Joon-ho Bong, and it is a monster dramedy. I don't know, it's a really good movie, but it's got a whole lot of genres mixing all in one place with one very visible monster. Should be interesting to talk about today. And what's our last film today?
And we wrap up with The Good, the Bad, the Weird from 2008, directed by Ji-woon Kim. And it is action comedy, as you could tell from the title, very influenced by The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly and other action adventure films and lots of westerns.
Yeah, it takes place in an interesting genre called the Manchurian Western, which we're going to talk about later on. But for now, let's talk about our first film of the day, Oldboy. To be clear, this is the Oldboy from 2003, the original version that we're talking about today, not the later remake, which I don't know much about. I don't know if I want to know much about it, but I don't know much about it. So that's
I've not heard great things.
So Oldboy from 2003 is, like we mentioned, a tale of vengeance. And it's a tale about kind of a normal guy. He's kind of useless at the start of the film, where we see him. He's drunk in a police station, and outside that police station, he gets kidnapped. And then he is held in one place for 15 years. It's kind of a prison, but like an off the books type prison. And once he gets out,
it looks like a crappy hotel room. Yeah,
like a really, really bad hotel room with scary art on the wall and ants crawling everywhere. If they're real, I don't know. But eventually he is released / escaped and goes on a path of vengeance. His goal is to track down the people who did this to him and exact vengeance. He meets a woman who kind of becomes his partner in crime, so to speak, or partner in vengeance. And there's a very complicated backstory to all of this. There's a very complicated labyrinth of twists and turns and reveals and mysteries and noir to the film. But I don't want to go too deep into it because the reveals in this film are exceptionally good, and they are really, really worth watching and not having spoiled.
Yeah, there is a lot of complexity, a lot of spoilers. So this is kind of a minefield that we will be tiptoeing around. But we do want to get back into our discussion of neo-noir, which we brought up, I believe, in the Christopher Nolan episode. And Mulholland Drive, actually, all of the films that we talked about with David Lynch also probably fall into neo-noir. And this is up there too. This is on that list of greatest films from the century so far with Mulholland Drive. And it definitely gives off the same vibe as Chinatown, Mulholland Drive, Memento, those kinds of movies. And there are certain elements that we see kind of pervading neo-noir that we can see in this movie too. So we just kind of wanted to step through some of those just to kind of give a better idea of what constitutes neo-noir. And someday, hopefully, we'll do a noir week and get into classic noir.
Right, going back to the classic stuff, the black and white films, because one of the big definers of neo-noir is color, partially because it is just new. The neo in the name might have given that away. And color has been the status quo of films for a very long time. But more than that, it's the use of color to convey certain things or to create motifs. For instance, in Oldboy, the colors red and violet are used a lot throughout the film, partially because it's a very violent film, it's a very angry film. Yeah. So all the red and violet is actually used as a plot device, as the bad guy is always surrounded by the color violet.
Yeah, and our protagonist is often surrounded by the color red, especially in the hotel room and stuff like that, because he has a lot of pent-up rage for being imprisoned for 15 years without ever being given an explanation. And it's interesting, the color in neo-noir, because as we've talked about, noir is clearly the word means dark. So it's all about shadows and darkness, which might also imply like a desaturation and stuff. And sometimes it does, but often in neo-noir, colors are actually kind of boosted up and they're very vibrant and kind of xenon-ish. And so think Blade Runner. Blade Runner is neo-noir, but it has a lot of colors because you have all of the city lights and everything going on. So you get lots of greens and blues and pinks and stuff like that. And that is actually a fairly common thread. There were lots of colors in Mulholland Drive as well that are very bright and punched up, which feels like it might not fit, but these films use them to accent often much of the dark things that are going on, and then shadows are thrown into all of those colors.
I think you can trace back the way color is used so expressively in neo-noirs, and especially in Oldboy, because we're talking about today, back to regular noir, old noir, if you want to call it that, which uses shadows expressively, going all the way back to the German expressionist episode a couple weeks ago there, but uses those shadows expressively to convey the emotion. And that's why it's so strong, and that's why it developed that reputation for being dark. And so obviously when you add color in, you can use that color to be expressive in turn, and that weirdly enough means pumping up the color rather than playing it down to a dark level.
And the other thing that will actually bring us into the next point about neo-noir is that these films often deal with very kind of archetypal and heightened emotions and themes, and colors are a great way to present that because they're so symbolic. Every color has so many meanings and emotions and feelings attached to it that it lends itself really well. So you think of Vertigo and the way that all the colors are used in Vertigo, depending on which character we're looking at and what stage of their character arc that they are in. And, you know, just by looking at the colors, you can pretty much tell what's going on in the film. If you have it on mute, you could probably, and specifically in Vertigo, but also in many of these films, but kind of follow the colors and follow the characters and almost follow the whole story just by using those visual signifiers of tone and emotion and feeling.
It's a very effective emotion, like visual cue to trigger those emotions, because we've all seen those things that are like, this color represents this kind of emotion, and like if you paint a kitchen orange, it'll make you hungry, and if you paint a bedroom blue, it'll make you calm, and yada, yada, yada. And whether or not that's actually true on a psychological level, I do think you can connect those things through both force of habit, and if you just use them repeatedly in a movie, you can associate two things regardless. Like, there's no reason Violet has to be associated with the bad guy in Oldboy, but it's used enough so that it is associated with him, and it triggers a certain response in the audience by the end of the film when you use it like that.
And there are certain connotations to the color purple that obviously go into the choice to associate him with it. It's kind of a royal color, and he's very rich and wealthy and in control of this whole situation. So associating purple with him kind of associates this feeling of dominance. And regardless of what the psychological importance of them is, over time, as we've built up this language of film, like we've been talking about, colors are part of those building blocks. So the language of colors has been being developed way before film through painting and theater and stuff like that. And so we already have all of these associations with certain colors, and then they just become building blocks that filmmakers can use and say, okay, what color can I use to get this impression across about this character? Purple fits the bill well for this one, so we're going to find places where we can kind of track that through. And what colors are associated with anger and pent-up rage? Okay, let's make the hotel room walls red, and that will give that impression because that is just what that color has been associated with as this building block.
Oldboy in particular, too, is very tragic, and we won't explain why, obviously. But it is tragic, and a lot of neo-noirs are tragic, partially in the sense that they're sad. I mean, very much so in the sense that they're sad, but also in the much older use of the word tragic, the much more classical use of tragic, like Greek tragedy, and that form of storytelling.
And we have a great video essay that will kind of talk through why it's kind of specifically associated with Greek tragedy. There are words I could use to describe it that would be spoilers. And the whole video is spoilers. So throwing that out there. But yeah, it's a lot of the elements that bring it to tragedy is this idea of cause and effect. The whole film is one thing leads to one thing, leads to one thing, leads to one thing. And it's the effects are often consequences, bad effects that happen, and we're following our character as he makes one decision after another that brings about negative consequences to him and the people in his life that he loves, because of the antagonist, who again is kind of in control of this whole situation, pulling the strings. And yeah, so just all of those things culminating to the end in a Grecian or Shakespearean style tragedy ending, which I don't think spoils it. You can go into a film knowing that it's tragedy and still get a lot out of it, even if you kind of have an idea where it's all going. You don't not read Hamlet because you know that everyone dies at the end.
Right. I mean, one of the key parts of tragedy is the reveal at the end, which, reveals that tragic irony that's been underlying the entire story. And that's what we mean when we say cause and effect as well, because, at face value, cause and effect could sound like just any old movie where one thing leads to another. But in terms of neo-noir, and particularly a tragic neo-noir, which, like we're saying, is pretty much all of them, and especially Oldboy, which is an especially tragic neo-noir, you're looking at very intricate causes and effects. Like, nothing is a coincidence, and every cause and every effect has a meaning, and reflects on the characters involved in those who cause and those who are affected by those causes.
Yeah, and another element of tragedy is the tragic flaw in the protagonist that is often, something that's not necessarily an intentional misstep or something that they did, but leads to their downfall, kind of without their being aware of it until the very end. And that happens here too, although I won't go too deeply into that again.
Certainly.
Spoilers.
Yeah, certainly. And all that is to say that Oldboy has a very intricate plot that is very messed up in one part, in one way. But it's also very interesting to see how it is revealed over the course of the film, bit by bit. And it has to be earned, too, by the characters. Like, they really fight and they really suffer over the course of the film to get to where they are at the end, which maybe isn't better than where they started out at.
And the last kind of element that we just kind of threw together, our little non-canon list of what makes neo-noir, is an element of narration, which is kind of pulls over from classic noir and is kind of, as the video essay that we'll link to, kind of relates to a classic chorus. It's just a way to guide us through the character's emotions without having to imply it. So we know what he's feeling because he tells us through the narration. It's something that we know about the character that the other characters on screen don't know. And sometimes it's played kind of comically, and sometimes it just is kind of a help to us to know that. But it's not something you see a whole lot anymore. So it's interesting. Narration has become kind of a taboo in filmmaking because it was used a whole lot in the 40s through 60s. So it was interesting to see that. And there were also some other really interesting techniques that this film does not shy away from using, like we've talked about with some other films, all the things at its disposal of being a film that other mediums can't take advantage of. And so some of those are like, drawing in the air or weird surreal sequences.
And when we say drawing in the air, we mean like Mia Wallace in Pulp Fiction, where she's telling John Travolta's character not to be so square, and then she draws a square in the air, but a rectangle appears in the air. That's always bugged me. But anyway, that's what we're pointing. Like they use that technique at a point, and there's a very closely connected point near that where there's a very long one-er take of our main character fighting a whole bunch of people in a hallway for a very long period of time. It's a very long one-er, and it's a very intense, brutal, violent fight.
Action scene, yeah.
But it conveys a lot about the character. But it also reminded me of very long fight one-ers like Daredevil, which put together two very good and very extended fight sequences in each of its seasons so far. And what's more, all of these techniques make the film interesting and make it unique, but they're also just fun. And you can't forget to make a film fun, and sometimes you need that, especially in certain films. And I think those moments, which can give the audience a bit of a smile or a bit of a burst of enjoyment, are important in a film like Oldboy, which is just so tragic. Because it's hard to go through a film that is almost 2 hours long and be sad the whole darn time.
Yeah, and it's even worse watching it the second time, knowing exactly how it's going to end makes repeated viewings even more difficult than the first one. But yeah, and it's interesting that they use that, the dashed line thing, because that does happen right before this fight, and this is just a little minor spoiler. It's not a plot point or anything, but basically it's used when he's about to use a hammer on a guy's head, and it draws an arrow or a little line from the hammer to the guy's head right before he bashes it in, and everyone comes out and he starts fighting them. And like you said, it's really intense. So it was this weird, like, kind of, take back moment that reminds you that you're in a movie right before we get into one of the most intense parts of the whole movie. Out of a really intense movie. Right.
It's not like easy competition when we're saying a scene is intense and violent in Oldboy, because there's some intense stuff in Oldboy. There's some interrogation scenes which make the Marathon Man scene look like weak sauce. But, It's definitely an interesting film, and that violence is, I feel like it's key to the themes of the film. It's not just excessive for entertainment's sake, but it relates into this being a very cruel, being a very harsh world, where everybody is kind of out to get everybody else, almost dog eat dog. Everybody's looking after their own interests.
Yeah, dog eat dog or man eat octopus.
The man eat octopus. Yeah, no, octopi were harmed in the making of this film. How many takes do you think they did on that shot? Just curious.
At least 2, because there were 2 angles.
You could have had 2 cameras rolling.
Yeah, so just to be clear, if you're going into this film, know that the main character eats a live octopus on camera. And this was not a CGI effect, because this is a thing that people actually do. So
yeah,
I think it's a safe bet that this happened for real. But to our American sensibilities, it was like, whoa, hey there, tentacles writhing out of your mouth.
It didn't seem like a pleasant experience.
Unless they turned that camera around really quickly, there were definitely at least 2 takes.
Oh, was it that different of an angle change? It could have been. I don't know.
It was like straight on and then straight above.
You could have had.
I guess 2 cameras would have worked there. You could have
done that with 2 cameras. Yeah, I mean, most films shoot with the B camera for coverage anyway. And if you're gonna get your lead actor to do octopi stunts, you better have like 10 cameras shooting him. Like.
Right, because the other part about this is that basically he passes out in the middle of eating the octopus, so it's staying in his mouth for a prolonged period of time, not being chewed and killed.
Yeah, which even if you're
that's dangerous. That is a stunt.
Yeah, like even if you're into eating octopi, like that can't be fun. Like you don't want to sit it with there with it in your mouth while you're passed out. Like no.
Yeah.
Like
tentacling your face.
Unpleasant. Anyway. But back to more pleasant topics like violence and Oldboy.
Like Oldboy. One more thing about the surreal sequence that I mentioned, because it's almost directly surreal. There's a point where in the hotel room, he's kind of going crazy, and an ant crawls out of his arm, and then a ton of ants are just surrounding him. And it reminded me a lot of the famous ants crawling out of the hand bit from Un Chien Andalou. And I don't know if that was intentional, but I feel like that film is kind of ubiquitous enough in the film, circles, even foreign film circles, that it could have been a reference. But then there was another ant bit a couple minutes later that was just so bizarre and so felt out of place in this movie. But it was there, so...
Yeah, all 3 of the films that we're going to talk about today can get real weird real quick, but in very entertaining ways, and especially in Oldboy, very meaningful ways. And we should talk about some of this violence in detail, this gratuitous violence, because why not? For instance, we already talked about a guy's...
That's what we're going to be talking about for all of these movies, yeah. So just to give a point of reference.
We already talked about a guy eating a live octopus and another guy getting his head bashed in with a hammer, but there's also a scene where people's teeth get pulled out, like one by one.
Also with a hammer.
Also with the hammer. There's stabbing with very unique weapons, which I find interesting just because, as you all know, I have a long-standing... grudge against the overuse of guns in films. So anytime they use like a hammer or scissors or something like that, I'm like, yeah, that's interesting. That's unique. It's also really, really
There were some
gory.
Interesting uses of guns in this movie, though, with one specific match cut that, I'm still thinking about because it's one of the most climactic just cuts in the movie.
And all of this to say that, yes, we're going to be dealing with some very violent films today, but I feel like the violence in all of the films has like a distinct point. Obviously it's entertaining, and we all, or most people, enjoy watching some violence in the movie magic world. But
to an extent, at least, yeah.
But in Oldboy, like all of this violence isn't just violent for violence sake. Like it's pulpy, but it's not like completely pulpy. It's all there for like
It's definitely
thematic.
not Tarantino levels of gore.
No, and it's all there like at least on a thematic level. Even if whatever the violent action is significant, and is just done in like a gratuitous way for extra value and extra emphasis. None of this is just out there for entertainment's sake only. It's all there for either the thematic drive or the character growth of our protagonist, because he kind of makes a point of making himself into a tough fighter over the course of the film, and then we question whether or not he's tough enough towards the end, and yada yada yada. And I can't get into details on it, obviously, but the violence does provide an interesting track throughout the course of the film. And like we mentioned before, Oldboy isn't the only film with violence today. All of them have a lot of violence. So let's transition from it being an old man with a hammer to being a CGI monster with a weird mouth in The Host. Jonathan, do you want to set us up for that one?
Yeah, The Host is a monster movie, and it follows
Whoa.
It's a monster movie. This is... Oh, just to clarify, this is The Host from 2006. This is not the Stephanie Meyer dystopian YA novel or subsequent film edition that was made in America. So this is a monster movie, and I mean, most monster movies have a pretty easy to boil down premise. So basically, a mortician at a U.S. Army base in Korea orders just tons of formaldehyde dumped down the drain, which is actually a thing that happened. But that's where the similarities to reality end. And basically, all these toxic chemicals that are dumped into the Han River in Korea create a mutation in one of the fish, which grows up to be this giant monster that is like a fish with feet and lots of fins and a mouth that resembles the Gorgon from Stranger Things. If you have seen that.
That's a pretty solid description of it.
But yeah, as you said, they don't shy away from showing the monsters, so I don't feel bad about, describing it, because it is a huge part of this movie, and it's all CGI, and it actually looks pretty good. We've harped on CGI before, but it really did not bother me in this film, and it was very character driven, and the CGI was good enough that I was just enjoying watching the monster, and it was so interesting. It was very different. It's not like a lot of monsters that kind of look very similar nowadays, but it was very unique. Every time you saw a different part of it, it was like, oh, look, its toes are very interesting and that kind of stuff. So at some point, a bunch of people on the banks of the river end up noticing the fish monster thing and throwing food at it just to see what would happen. And once people find out that, oh, it'll grab it with its tail, they all start throwing food at it. And that makes it kind of angry or interested or something. And it jumps up and starts terrorizing all the people on the bank and ends up kidnapping the daughter of our protagonist. Our protagonist being Gangdu Park, who, is a single father, and he lives with his dad. And throughout the film, his brother and sister end up joining in this search for his daughter, who has been kidnapped by the monster and taken somewhere, and they're trying to find her. And that's basically what we follow through a bunch of political red tape where, once the monster gets out, then all the government people are trying to shut down the situation, and no one can get near where the monster is, and they end up coming up with this toxic element that they hope to eradicate the monster that may have other environmental effects along with it. And it's at its core, though, it's about a father trying to get back to his daughter, and lots of people getting eaten along the way.
And all of the family drama that ensues, and all of the more people who get eaten along the way. There's a weird mix of tones in this film, because there definitely is, the monster movie, monsters, big scary, but they don't treat it in the same way that you're used to in monster movies treating monsters. The monster doesn't lurk in the dark. It's just out in the daylight most of the time, running around eating people.
That's one of the things I noticed, is that it acted more like just a normal animal than a lot of other monster films where the monster is played for scares and jumps and stuff like that. It just felt like it was going about doing its business, getting food, even though that food happened to be people.
Yeah, and that doesn't fly with people. So the people are going to do a thing about it. But yeah, and it's an especially bold approach considering the monster's entirely CGI, and that's really ballsy. That's like, we're really confident in our CGI. We're going to put this thing in broad daylight. And the first scene where the monster is running around the park front near the river is just really impressive, because that monster's out in full daylight, running around, eating people, chasing people,
interacting with people.
Being attacked by people. And it's really well done, and it's looks, like we said, really good for CGI that is now like 11 years old.
Right. And when we're talking about violence and stuff like that for entertainment, this film definitely falls in the category of entertainment more than, say, Oldboy, where I wouldn't call the violence entertaining, but I would call it meaningful. Like, the violence has a purpose in Oldboy, even if you're not enjoying watching it. The Host is more fun, even though it is kind of tragic things happening in terms of people dying, but it's definitely played more as a popcorn movie. And also because of this mix of tone that we've been talking about, which is the fact that all of the stuff that happens with the family, the Parks, the two brothers and the sister and the dad is like slapstick style comedy, like almost Will Ferrell kind of comedic moments happening that were just kind of really surprising. So we go from like maybe one character making comments about farting to getting his head bashed on the sidewalk, and you're like, oh, wow, this is one movie.
Yeah. There's moments where like a guy in a hazmat suit runs in to deliver some really urgent news about the quote unquote virus, and then just falls on his ass, like just right out of the gate. And
just right away.
Yeah, and it's very it's an interesting mix. And the weird thing is, as you watch the movie and as you get used to it, like that's exactly it. You get used to it, and it doesn't mess with your enjoyment of the film much. It is off. It is kind of weird, maybe, so to speak, but I kind of like it by the end.
It's not what we're used to.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, it's once you kind of realize what it's going for at the beginning, it's a matter of just, realizing that these two tones are existing, but the film does a good job of knowing when to pull each one out. It doesn't it does it like tastefully, for lack of a better word. So, the points where it's an emotional search for the daughter or the daughter is in peril, these moments are played with a lot of gravitas and sincerity. And then when we're having some downtime, or they're just kind of searching and they can't find much, then we have that downtime to throw in a little bit more of comedic elements and this dysfunctional family drama that also comes off as very funny, because the two sons are quite immature, whereas the girls are definitely the more competent ones of the family.
Oh, certainly. And I think perhaps the oddest moment is when the family comes together to what they think at that time is mourning the loss of the daughter. And I feel like that's not too big of a spoiler. That happens very early in the film. And like we said,
right after she gets kidnapped.
And we've already been saying that they spend most of the film searching for the daughter. So something has to kick that off. But anyway, they come together to mourn the loss of one of the protagonist's daughter, and they just start crying and yelling at each other, and then they keep crying and fall over on the floor in a blubbery mess, and they're rolling all around the floor, and eventually people
Is it not by themselves? Like, there's a lot of people.
Yeah, it's like a public memorial. Yeah, and like they're like rolling over each other and crying some more, and then people eventually have to come in and break them up. And I think that was the moment for me where I was like, what kind of movie is this? Like, what's gonna happen? And from what I've been able to find, this director, Bong Joon-ho, is kind of notorious for putting slapsticky, not so smart characters in his films. And wow, did he hit the nail on the head with this one? Because the characters are that. Like even the sister's kind of slow. And they're kind of slapsticky.
That was the whole point, is that she was slow.
Yeah, that was the whole point, was that she's slow. She's an archer, and
I didn't know if you're making a joke on purpose or not.
Yeah, the point is that she took too long to release. She didn't hit her time limit.
And that's an interesting element too, this idea that they set her up, she's an archer, they set her up as having almost like we were just talking about, a tragic flaw of taking too long to release her shot. Which I thought was going to have a really big payoff at the end, but it didn't really. I mean, she uses her archery skills throughout the movie, but there wasn't this big climactic moment where she has to release the arrow at exactly the right time or anything like that. And so that kind of goes into something about this movie that is, in contrast to Oldboy, this movie kind of just has to be taken at face value. You know, it has a lot of themes. It has a lot of family togetherness themes, and this, you know, what would you do for your family, and you know, forgiving family members and stuff like that. But they're pretty surface, they're pretty obvious when you watch it, and it's just essentially a movie about watching this family of everymans take on this giant monster.
Yeah, you're every monster.
Every monster.
You're every monster. Yeah, there's you know, occasionally here and there across the film, there's some sprinkling of what might be a political message. The director,
but it's not harped on.
But it's not harped on, and the director has like defiantly said that that's not the point of the film. It's just based on that one situation that happened where an American dumped a bunch of formaldehyde down the drain. Which in real life, like, it went through a couple treatment plants, but still he shouldn't have done that. And it sparked some anti-American protests in the city. And it was the whole thing. And that kind of resonates throughout this film as there's protests against Americans who want to deploy the Agent Yellow, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, Agent Orange from the Vietnam War. But I will say the Agent Yellow thing is not like harped on politically, but it does, the deployment machine that they build for it does look exactly like the monster.
And yeah, the Americans are definitely not the good guys in this film. And it's definitely set up that way because the obviously the United States mortician who has all the formaldehyde dumped in has like the flimsiest excuse in the world. Is just basically a mustache twirling moment of let's put all this formaldehyde in the river or whatever the heck. And then there's like one character that you think might be a good guy, and then he's not. But they're also like minor characters that is really mostly just about the monster. And this is to say, like, the director Joon-ho Bong has made films that have more of an overt political message. This just isn't one of them. So, for example, we'll kind of plug here the other films that he's made, which are Snowpiercer, which made a pretty big splash both in the United States and in Korea. It's an American film starring Chris Evans, and that was definitely a commentary on commercialism, and that's based on a French book. So there's a lot of nationalities going into that movie. And also, he has just released Okja on Netflix, free plug of the week, which is about a genetically modified pig, essentially.
I think it's a pig.
Yeah, I think it's supposed to be a pig-ish.
Oh, okay. Anyway, continue.
But it has been built to provide food. And so there's the corporate side of it, where this is a large animal that can provide a lot of food. And then there's the animal protection services who want to protect this new creature that we've made. And I've heard that it even that film is more about the connection that you can see in the trailers between the little girl and the Okja. But it's got a lot of political overtones, even if it is not a necessarily a political statement one way or the other. So all that's to say is that The Host is has some of those themes in it, but it's not about that. It's about a monster and a father trying to save his daughter.
Right. And if there is a political message in The Host, it's more about government incompetence, because the South Korean government is not a shining star in this film either. There's a lot of just mistakes and failed cover-up of mistakes by both governments in the film. But yeah, definitely check out those other Bong Joon-ho films. Very good. Do recommend.
Since we're on the point of Joon-ho Bong's other films, I do want to mention we have a little bit of further watching this week, but mostly just from this director, because he has a couple films on Netflix. So along with The Host, which is on Netflix, and Oldboy, actually all three of our films are on Netflix. But along with that, we also have Mother, which is a film that comes out right after The Host, I believe, and it is more of a action crime drama. And then also Okja, which we've just been talking about, and which Netflix has probably already pushed to you in some way or another. So we recommend those because it's a really good director, and I really enjoyed Snowpiercer whenever that came out several years ago. So if you get a chance, you can find those also on Netflix, streaming near you. But our last film, again, also streaming on Netflix, is The Good, the Bad, the Weird. Alex, set us up.
Right. So, 2008, The Good, the Bad, the Weird is a Manchurian Western. What is a Manchurian Western, you ask? Well, let me tell you. A Manchurian Western takes place during the period of Japanese occupation on the mainland Asian continent in the early 20th century. So we're talking like 1930s, 1940s, in the drum roll up to World War II. And Korea is occupied by Japan, and Manchuria is mostly occupied by Japan. And a lot of that region is high plains. So what you see in the film and what you think of when you think cowboys. And this story takes place in that setting and tells the story of a gangster, a train robber, and a bounty hunter. Respectively, the bounty hunter is the good, the gangster is the bad, and the weird is the train robber. So the good is Park Do-won, the bad is Park Chang-yi, and the weird is Yoon Tae-gu. But I'm just going to call them the good, the bad, the weird, because that's way easier. Character names are hard, y'all. But it tells the story.
Korean names are hard for us dumb Americans.
That's true. I mean, I would forget their names if it was John, Jack, and Bob. So I just have a bad brain. But when it comes to movies, I hope it's okay. And this movie tells the story of a treasure map that has a treasure somewhere along the Manchurian-Russian border, and everybody is on the hunt for it after like the first 30 minutes of the film. The good is hunting the bad and the weird, who are both wanted for money. The bad is after it because he's a gangster and he wants money. He's also after the weird because they have a tumultuous past together, which I won't reveal. And the weird is after it because he wants money to set himself and his sick grandmother up for the rest of their lives. And of course, we have to throw in the Japanese army, the Korean resistance fighters, and various gangs of just gang thief people throughout this world who are all after the treasure. And of course, gunfights, swashbuckling, and shenanigans ensue in the hunt for this treasure as people team up with each other and betray each other. And it culminates in a thing what you probably expected it to culminate in, but I'm not going to spoil it.
Yeah, and, you know, another term for shenanigans is screwball comedy antics, which this film is full of, and even, you know, makes a reference to, actually pulls a direct audio sample from one of the most famous screwball comedies ever, It Happened One Night. But that's just one of the many references. Like, this film is just fun. We've gone fully from our tragic film to one that is semi-tragic, but mostly just enjoyable to watch start to finish. It does have violence, but it's a movie that pays homage to action adventure movies. So again, we have the title, The Good, the Bad, the Weird. We have lots of Western stuff, but we also have references to Indiana Jones and the Great Train Robbery, because it's a train robbery. But
Anything
all of
with
these
the
things, it's just
references the Great Train Robbery.
yeah, but it's just a movie that loves the genre and just has a whole lot of fun with it, with a great cast and a great production value.
Yeah, and it's definitely a nice refresher after we've spent so many weeks talking really deeply about big film movements and film theory, to just kind of sit back and relax with a really, really well-made, really smartly made movie that, maybe it doesn't approach too big of a theme. The big theme in the movie seems to be you're always chasing something and somebody's always chasing you, which certainly happens over the course of the film. I mean, like the last hour of the film, and I feel like this isn't like a huge giveaway, is like Mad Max on horses almost, with everybody chasing everybody.
Yeah, it's again like Indiana Jones, when it's just a mad dash to get to the Ark, except in this case they have a treasure map and they're all trying to get to the treasure map. It follows in a long line of movies that are almost formulaic, but the just amount of charm and spunk that this movie has makes it just the greatest ride to go along with.
It's completely fun without being stupid. And I really appreciate that in a film. I like popcorn films that are fun to just sit back and watch without feeling like they're undervaluing your intelligence as an audience.
And yet, like all these things that we're talking about, I was watching it, and then it's got all the violence that we've been talking about with our other Korean films, and it's really brutal. The parts that are violent are very brutal, and I'm like, this would be almost like a great kids film, like Raiders or something, or Star Wars or something like that, if it weren't for how far the violent parts go. But it was interesting because, for an older audience, it's more fun. Again, the violence here is played for entertainment. There's some very well choreographed fighting. There's some interesting torture and interesting kills in the film that are fun to watch, but definitely not for kids as fun as the rest of the movie is.
Yeah. Although one of them is committed by a child. Does that help?
That's true.
The child who was being held as a slave by a prostitution house and then stabs the slaver up the butt with like the tip of a spear.
Yeah, but he was learning from example.
Yeah, Weird was in that scene too, and he had just killed a guard the same way. And it was totally, like, the first time he did it, it was totally a matter of accident. And then, kids being kids, they emulate the adults around them. And if that means if you have to kill somebody to kill them up the butt, that means do that.
And the other thing that this film has in it is heartthrobs. Both bad and good are very well-known Korean actors who are extremely popular, especially with the younger woman crowd. And so we've got charisma going into all of this, and it's a good date movie, I would say that. But it's just got so much packed into it, and it's so confident in itself and so well done that, it's just a great movie to watch and turn your brain off. Because like you said, it's not full of themes. It's kind of the opposite end of Oldboy, where we still have violence and action, but we don't have to analyze it. We just have to enjoy it.
Yeah, this is action for entertainment's sake, almost purely.
In the purest sense, yeah.
Yeah, but it isn't. But it's done so well that I don't have a problem with it. Like the cinematography, the way they shoot the action scenes is just phenomenal.
Genius.
First of all, let me just say that it's easy to follow. And that might not sound like too big of a thing, but when it comes to action scenes, that's maybe the hardest thing to achieve, is action that is easy to follow. Especially when you have like various gangs of people and different agents like running around a single like giant marketplace. And it's easy to get lost in because the set decoration looks fairly similar across the whole marketplace. So how do you make sure that you know where good is and you know where bad is and you know where weird is in relation to each other as they're fighting all these different people?
Yeah, and what makes the cinematography so great is how dynamic it is. There are some great compositions, but the main thing that I was noticing is the fact that they were using cranes and jibs and just following like people running, and it's just the camera just glides through all of these scenes seamlessly. It's not jarring and it's not shaky and blurry, so they can kind of hide things. It's like a dance with the action and the camera going through all of these scenes, like you said, through the marketplace. So there's a lot of things happening, but the cinematography just feels so easy and so mobile.
Right. And there's a lot of good like setup payoff and a lot of the action shots that I just really, really enjoy. There's one good shot where Weird creeps over, looks out a window, and the camera pans to follow him, and then he looks and you see a bad guy moving around on the roof across the street, and then Weird moves back away from the window and is prepping to do something else, and then you move back over to the window to see the bad guy from across the street suddenly swinging into the window on a rope, and it's just this great little all-in-one shot, like a story. Like Weird looks out the window, we see a guy getting ready, then he's surprised by the guy swinging in the window. And that's just a really good way to shoot action, is this put the setup and payoff of one event all into one shot and shoot it in a very clever way that keeps the audience entertained with the movement of the camera.
And again, intermixed in all of this, we have just goofy comedy. So like if the train stops too fast and then Weird ends up on his head and his butt is sticking up in the camera, and that's played for laughs. And there's a point where Weird is clearly the comic relief, so a lot of these things relate to him, but he's fighting this guy who's much bigger than him, who has raised him by the neck through the roof of a building, and he sees Good and he's like, hey, give me a pistol or something. And Good just kind of nonchalantly throws 2 pistols behind him without even looking and totally misses him. So it was like, oh, okay, thanks, not.
Yeah.
It ends up helping him out, but it was just like, okay, he tried, but then he didn't try very hard.
Right.
So it's played for laughs again.
And I think one of the parts that just makes this film work so well is that the Weird is exceptionally, weird. And maybe some more mysterious at certain points, but he definitely, is the comic relief of the film. The bad is exceptionally bad. He plays a very good bad guy. And the good, he holds the same poise as Clint Eastwood's character, and he holds the same moral ambiguity that Clint Eastwood's character holds. And he plays it for poise. Like he has the same kind of strength radiating out of him and composure, rather than like the silence that Clint Eastwood plays it with, maybe. But maybe that would have been too on the nose too, to go that close.
Yeah, I thought Good was a little bit more clean and nice than Clint Eastwood comes across as. He comes across as good-hearted but gruff. Clint Eastwood does, whereas again, this is played by. Good here is played by an actor who does a lot of kind of romantic films, and he is again that heartthrob kind of character, but he has that confidence. So whenever he goes into a confrontation, he feels like he can take it on, and he's the one with all the rumors like, oh, he's the best, he could totally take you on bad and all this kind of stuff. And so we feel safe whenever he's on screen that he's going to make it out okay.
And that's all like key elements of like a popcorn movie, is knowing which character is which. And it just makes it enjoyable and easy to watch, and you don't get muddied down in thinking too much during this film. But it's entertaining, and it's the best kind of entertaining filmmaking around.
And another thing that goes into action adventure and popcorn movies is MacGuffins, which we have talked about a lot on the podcast because they are all over cinema. And the MacGuffin in this film, you could say, is the map, because that's what everyone is after, or more specifically, whatever the map leads to, but only Weird knows where it's going. And it's interesting because we don't know what the map is for. Weird gets possession of the map without knowing anything about it. So everyone is chasing after this map, and it doesn't really affect the audience one way or another. But the fact that we don't know what the map is to, and then that's such a big part of the movie, kind of raises this element, this map, to a little bit of a higher level than MacGuffin, because a lot of times MacGuffins are very surface level. So, the plans of the Death Star, we know what the plans of the Death Star are, we know why they're important, everyone is after them, but it doesn't affect us. We're just like, okay, we know what that object is, we know why people are going after it. But if you can add an extra element to the MacGuffin that gives the audience an investment in it, I think that is just one more thing that makes your audience stick with your story and makes it that much more interesting.
It certainly is. And in this film, the only people who do know what the map leads to is the Japanese army, who's kind of just there for more action and comedy, and they do provide it. But they certainly don't tell the audience what the map is for. I don't want to spoil that either. So let's talk about something else.
Yeah, there's a great payoff when we finally get to the X marks the spot. But we didn't talk too much specifically about the violence. We said that it was brutal, but I mean, we
mentioned people getting stabbed at the butt. Does that count?
There is a spear to the butt.
Multiple.
But there's also, yeah, that's true. And there's also this rumor about a character called the Finger Cutter, whose trademark, the Finger Chopper, whose trademark is to cut off his victim's fingers, as you can imagine. But we don't know who it is. They're kind of like this ghostly character who, it could be anybody. But, we see flashbacks of it, and we see people's fingers getting cut off. We see someone's finger attempt to get cut off. We see in another flashback Bad doing like swirls and, just using a knife to its full potential in really beautifully choreographed fight scenes and stuff like that. And again, Alex, we have knives and swords, like all kinds of weapons being used in this movie, even though there are guns. And there's actually a point where a knife and a gun are used in conjunction against a centipede. And that was really interesting.
Yeah, it certainly was. They get very creative with the violence in this one. And we can see again in this film this week that violence being used in a slightly different way of using it to just purely entertain in a certain sense. Yeah. Like, it isn't scary like it is in The Host. And, it can be intimidating, I guess. And it could be scary depending on how you watch it. But it's not meant to be frightening in the same, like, horror sense of a monster movie. And it isn't meant to be super duper thematically resonant like it is in Oldboy. But in this film, it's just really, really entertaining to watch. To see how cleverly they do it and see how cleverly they shoot it, no pun intended, to make it an entertaining and enjoyable film.
And, the last mention of that is the climax of the film, which is, of course, an homage to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, but with a twist that, just kind of drives all the things we've been talking about home, adding that violence and comedy. And I think it worked out really well. Like, you're paying homage to one of the greatest climax sequences in film history, and I think they actually pulled it off. It wasn't too similar, and it fit the movie just right.
Yeah, I think that was the most important thing for me at that point in the film, was that they didn't deviate too far from what The Good, the Bad, and the Weird was to pay homage to what The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was. And I think they pulled it off really well. And I think in the way they did it, they actually added an interesting thematic note, a nice
It was almost a commentary on Western films.
Yeah. For what was actually going on in the good, the bad, and the ugly scene versus what I think most of us think was happening in the original climax.
And all that being said, let's take this into overall notes and talk about what we've pulled from these three films and what we can tentatively extrapolate into perhaps a larger Korean cinema context. And we've been harping a lot on the violence, but we have a very small sample size and we have not seen a whole lot of Korean film. But we feel pretty safe in saying this because, Roger Ebert actually had very similar sentiments in his Oldboy review, which I'll include a link to in the blog post. He writes, "I'm not an expert on the Korean cinema, which is considered in critical circles as one of the most creative in the world," which we've seen today. I can say that of the Korean films I've seen, only one did not contain extraordinary sadomasochism. So if that's saying anything, out of all the movies that Roger Ebert has seen, then I think we can safely assume that there is that thread that for whatever reason, a lot of films from the Korean film market have this weirdly violent tendency, even in their comedies and their other genre of films.
Yeah, and I think we can also say that they have a line of another genre coming in the slapstick humor sense. And I don't think that's like a cultural thing. I think it just came into the art at one point in time and just became part of the art and that stuck around. But that being said, it definitely is part of the movies we've watched today. And if the Roger Ebert quote is anything to stick to, and I think it's Roger Ebert, so it probably is, it definitely is a quality to watch out for in Korean films that you watch. And it's not like, every week on the world tour so far, we've been like, we need to watch more films from this country, as if our schedules weren't busy enough already. But we will,
Right.
And we will continue to watch out for these things. And I think those of you who follow the podcast and enjoy watching different kinds of cinema and broadening their view on cinema and culture too that goes along with that, Korean films are definitely worth a watch.
Yeah, and we are seeing, as opposed to maybe Indian cinema or a couple of the other countries we've talked about, we're seeing a lot of interest from the Western side in Korean film. For whatever reason, there seems to be this weird American infatuation with a lot of Korean culture, K-pop, et cetera, But, Oldboy has been hailed in both Korea and America. Same with The Host and Snowpiercer, and a lot of these movies that we've been talking about, I've heard of in normal contexts, not necessarily like film buffs and people who are actively searching out lesser known films. These titles have come up just in everyday cultural settings. So that's an interesting element to this too, is that you don't have to go very far to get exposure to Korean cinema. Again, all of the movies that we talked about today are on Netflix, and we did not pick them just because they were easy to get to.
Right. We actually had a bit more latitude with what we picked this week, which was refreshing. I really enjoyed that. And you can be sure that when Korean directors are making films in American markets like Snowpiercer, that they're going to have an influence on the art in that market. So if you're interested in seeing where some of, especially I think, big budget blockbusters will be heading over the next few decades, take a look at some Korean films and other, film markets that are starting to leak their identities and their trends into the American film market.
Yeah, and again, in certain specific genres, probably like the action genre, the horror genre to some extent, and neo-noir, darker, because, again, a lot of these tendencies, even the comedic relief and the lots of violence tend to lend themselves well to those specific genres. But we have seen that Koreas can incorporate those motifs into pretty much any genre.
That's true. That's true. And, we've already seen some of it. Like, I swear, I haven't found anything specifically saying it, but I swear Oldboy had a big impact on the 2 seasons of Daredevil that Netflix has put out so far. There's so many similarities in the way they're shot and the way the action is shot that I want to say there's a connection there. And even if there isn't a direct connection, I'm sure that Oldboy bringing up those themes and those trends more in the zeitgeist of the cinema world led to some influence of some kind in many American action pieces that have been made over the past decade.
Yeah, and again, it's on a lot of lists of top neo-noir films and even just top movies because of how many themes it tackles. So it is not a far stretch to say that some filmmaker working on, any of these films that we're seeing nowadays has seen this film or seen some of these films and been influenced by them because of that penetration for whatever reason that, Korea and Americans have that mixing of cultures or interaction at least. And that interaction is definitely one of the reasons why we have put it on the world tour, because we're trying to capture a lot of film markets that have had a huge influence on American cinema or are beginning to build up a name for themselves. And that is also what applies to the next country that we're going to. Alex, where are we off to next week?
Well, next week, Jonathan, we're off to Iran with a look at some of the best filmmakers that you probably don't know about. But the first film we're going to be talking about next week is Close Up from 1990. The second film is Children of Heaven from 1997. And the last film is A Separation from 2011.
Yeah, I know quite little about each of these films. I've heard some of the titles, but I don't know all that much about them. I think they're mostly dramatic, falling in a fairly similar genre, but we'll have to see. We'll have to see what we can get out of these 3 movies.
It's a country whose cinema has always popped up on the fringes of my film school education, but I am interested to take a deeper look at some of the filmmakers and films involved in Iran. But that's about all the time we have in Korea for now.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlinks.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next week.
All right, I'll see you in Iran. I guess we never specified that we're talking about South Korea, but as if there's going to be a lot of confusion about that.
Yeah, we can tag that at the end. Just use this as the tag.